Champions of Psychology is meant as education and entertainment. It is not a substitute for medical advice or professional counseling. Discussion of mental health topics will be primarily rooted in research and the personal experiences and self-disclosures of the hosts. While we can provide generalized education and possible mental health resources, we cannot offer any recommendations, advice, or opinions for any specific persons, cases, or situations. We provide these resources and links at our sole discretion, but have not necessarily vetted or reviewed any resource. We assume no liability for the use of the information or resources on these sites, and we encourage you to use your own best judgment.
Hello, and welcome to Champions Psychology, a show with the goal of openly talking about mental health and gaming, presented by Codename Entertainment and TakeThis.org. Every Tuesday at 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time here on twitch.tv/CNE Games, Mitra Jordan and Raffael Boccamazzo, aka Dr. B, talk about mental health and how gaming affects us. This week, it is good old two-person hangout with me and Mitra, and we are going to be talking about what is happily ever after. But before we do that, Mitra, who are you for the fine folks in this chat who may not know?
Hi, so I'm Mitra Jordan. I'm a registered clinical counselor working in Victoria, British Columbia, and I work with a lot of couples, as it turns out. And of course, I love games and spend a fair amount of time playing them with my family and sometimes talking about them with my clients. So,
yeah.
I'm particularly interested in issues related to relationships. The whys, the hows, the why not. Yes, go.
That's good, because that's what we're going to be talking about today.
That's handy. Imagine that.
It's almost like we planned this, and totally not less than an hour ago.
Totally not less than an hour.
Absolutely not.
Been thinking
Two
about it for
ADHD
weeks.
people that have a show to do, we had this planned months in advance.
And if we go sideways, you have no one to blame but ourselves.
if we go sideways, you have no one to blame but Dr. B for not being here wrangling us in.
Yes! He keeps us on track, even though he also has ADHD.
Yeah, that's
Boy,
true.
We're a fine group.
Yeah,
So.
Dr. B is at Dice this week, so he's over there hanging out with cool people and doing cool speeches, and he will be back next week. But let's start talking about this happily ever after idea. And Dr. B and I touched on this last week, but I guess we'll start with the definition. What do we mean by happily ever after?
So when we talk about happily ever after, it connotes a couple of things. And one is the fact that the road to commitment and relationship is kind of enshrined in our storytelling. And so this idea of happily ever after is very much about kind of the fairy tale, getting to true love, getting to that achievement, if you will. And so we're going to talk about, we're kind of unpacking our understanding of that statement. Why is it such a big deal, this happily ever after, or the idea of, in fact, how much pressure that puts on committed relationship, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then we'll do a bit of a deeper dive into commitment and love and what makes relationships work and what doesn't. So, yeah.
I realized while you're talking, I'm like, I actually don't know when happily ever after was like first used. Apparently 1702. We put happily
I'm so
ever
glad
after
you
on
looked that up.
Yeah, I didn't know that. I can't pronounce the name of the story that it was put in or the author's name. It's definitely a Dr. B situation, but that is interesting that it has been since 1702 that we've been using that term, and now it's just so widely used. It's like, oh yes, we lived happily ever after.
So it's kind of dismissive in a way, isn't it? And it's kind of like, it really cleans it up when you think about it. It's kind of like, okay, we've done with the important bit of the story, and now all you need to know is it was good.
Yeah.
All the villains were vanquished and the evil sisters removed, and now it's kind of the highway. At first it's like the course of true love that never did run smooth, but now we have runneth to the smooth part. It's smooth sailing.
Yes.
Nothing could be further from the truth.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And one of the things that we discussed in the pre-show was essentially like, the happily ever after is the commitment part of it. Like, the romance stories and everything like that is about like the tale of how they first met, the first obstacle they had to overcome as a couple, and then maybe a wizard showed up and was evil, but then at the end of the story, that's when like the commitment starts, and that's also where they end. Like
Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. So, and you really don't hear much about challenges in a marriage unless it gets tough enough that people are speaking bitterly to their friends or are coming to see someone like me. And I will say, I do wish people would come earlier. I really do wish people would decide to get support around their relationship sooner. And what I see now is a little bit of a trend in that direction, and it makes me very happy as a therapist to kind of have that happen. So let's talk a little bit then about commitment and what it means, because to me, commitment means far more than just marriage. I think, unfortunately, in a very sort of privileged heterosexual perspective, we're often thinking about commitment being between usually one male person and one female person, people who identify that way. And a lot of people haven't had the privilege or the legal freedom to get married if they wanted to. But marriage isn't the only way to understand commitment, because actually there has to be a committed decision to be together, usually before people get married. And in fact, I don't think married is the only way to do commitment. There are a lot of people in very committed relationships who haven't gone through a legal ceremony. They may choose to go through some other kind of ceremony. They may prefer no ceremony at all. But that doesn't mean that they're not committed to each other. And of course, commitment may include poly relationships. And so I think one's definition in terms of commitment can be quite private and personal, and be a decision that's very specific to you and the people or person that you love. So I just want to bring that into the conversation, that we're kind of broadening out what we mean here. I will say that I think if you have a commitment to more than one other person, it can be complex, and it requires really good boundaries, and it requires a very clear examination of your own vulnerability and your own understanding of what attachment can look like. It requires a lot of maturity, in other words. And I think it's not easy to do, from what I've seen and from the people I've worked with. So, yeah. All right.
Well, and so, I think that kind of ties into the discussion that Dr. B and I had last week around expectations of, going into these commitments with expectations and not, communicating them. My gosh, communication. Oh no. That's a problem.
Yeah, because I think the challenge is often we project onto other people what we expect and what we understand. And we have this idea that we're both on the same page, or that we're all on the same page. And so we go into this with kind of preconceptions sometimes about that we understand the other person when maybe we don't. And so, one example of that's small, but kind of relates, is we all have ideas about how to do an argument.
Okay.
And I remember one early argument, probably our first kind of quite tough argument, and my then fiance decided he was going to take a walk. So we're in the midst of this argument, and he heads to the door and he's putting on his shoes. And I would say at that point, certainly, I'd had a number of issues growing up in terms of, not having consistent family members around to take care of me. So I would say I had some level of anxious attachment happening. And so I'm in the middle of making a point. He's putting on his shoes, and I'm like, where are you going? And he's like, well, I'm gonna go take a walk. I'm like, what? You can't leave while we're having a fight. So,
I hadn't
you know,
actually thought about that of like, yeah, of discussing how do you argue? How do you handle a tough situation? That's because if your reason on that is like, oh, when I am faced with this tough situation, I go for a walk to think it over. That may come out of nowhere for the other person.
full on, full
Yeah.
on. And so I think that there's a lot of pieces to this in terms of understanding how we approach relationship. And so backing up for just a second, there was a question asked in the chat about does anyone, thank you, Maxik Bert, I love that, Maxik Bert, anyway, for asking, does anyone really believe this happy ever after thing? I think in the traditional sense of the way we use that as almost kind of a dismissal of like, yeah, it's all good. No, I don't. In the sense that can we negotiate and navigate a mature, caring, healthy relationship that mostly creates contentment and stability and moments of deep, true, profound happiness? Yes. Yeah, I believe that's possible. But it's work.
Yeah.
Like anything else. And it can sometimes feel like, I spent hours slaving over this meal in the kitchen, and now it's kind of done in 30 minutes and somebody's suffering indigestion. And that's true too.
Okay.
I ate too fast, So it is true that it's a lot of work. And we can actually get into a healthy fight, Starchaser. I'm kind of hoping to as we continue here. So yeah, I think so. So first of all, I think there are many challenges to to actually healthy, committed relationship because of culture, which I often say that. But what I mean here is that I think that because there's such a almost glorification of this kind of romantic path, and a lot of what we see in movies and TV and books and just all of our media is that you meet, you have a challenge or two, you work it out, you live happy ever after. It's not frequent that we're really kind of talking about our projections. And so even as I think about, having that fight and my partner needing a walk, my projection would have been that we stick it out in this argument. And I wasn't thinking about, in the long term we stick it out, but how we get there,
Yeah.
How we stay regulated while we argue is actually a big deal. A healthy argument is one where two people can mostly stay regulated, and where they can also deal well with the rupture and repair that comes of argument. And I'll get into what those mean in a second. But so because of our projections, that is how we see the other person, how we see the beloved when we first meet them, when we're first getting to know people. And we have an idea about how similar we are. And we have an idea about how perfect the other person is. And how quirky and cute and all of the stuff that happens when we fall in love with someone. We have a lot of ideas about what that means. That initial love really kind of greases the wheels. And unfortunately, sometimes also causes us to overlook really important things. Because we have quite a narrow focus, and that's only because we have quite a narrow knowledge. Really, unless you're developing love with someone you've known much of your life, there's going to be a lot of things you don't know about them.
Yeah.
And so you don't know how they fight. You might not know much about their family. You might not understand about the trauma they experienced. So you might not understand what really sets them off, activates, triggers, however you want to put it. You might not understand that either. And these are things that really kind of interfere for us. So when my then fiance was walking out the door, I had a huge fear of abandonment come up for me. And the other problem is, say we had 2 or 3 fights like that. We didn't, luckily, but say we did, right? Where the other person's walking out.
Yeah.
My understanding of our relationship would be based on this much knowledge, this much time, this much awareness. And based on that small amount of data, I might go, I can't do this. Every time we fight and he walks out, I can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how else he's going to abandon me, right? Because our trust is only based on what we know. And so our projection is limitless because of what we don't know. And our trust is small because of what little evidence we've managed to gather so far. And one of the things that I want to do when I work with people is broaden that picture out.
Okay.
First of all, really talk and get to know each other. And second, recognize everything doesn't need to be solved today.
Yeah.
If you have the basis of a relationship where you have evidence of integrity, they say what they say, they actually follow through on and do. How they treat you is also how they treat themselves and others. Are they kind to the waitstaff at the restaurant? Are they nice to the grocery checkout person? Do they care about those around them? Are you seeing evidence of this?
Yeah.
You know, and so gradually, once we build out this picture of integrity, of trust, of kindness, there are some other issues that crop up, but we don't have to solve them immediately. But we have to know what our non-negotiables are.
Yeah.
You can't go into a relationship thinking, oh, he said he doesn't want kids, but he does seem to like kids. It's fantastic uncle. So I'm sure he'll change his mind as time goes on. Like, no, don't do that to the other person or to yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so I think those are some of the pieces that are really important in terms of actually listening, not to the projection in your head, but actually checking out with the other person.
Yeah.
How important is it for you to have kids?
Mm-hmm.
Is it a non-negotiable, or is it more important to have a happy, healthy relationship and go travel and do other things? And, if the other person wants kids, you'll consider it. But is it like a really big thing in your life that you will not be happy or satisfied unless you have kids, or you get to go traveling a lot, or you want to be with someone whose work doesn't rule their life, who isn't super ambitious in that way? Like, these are all important,
Yeah.
I'm looking at the question of like, what if you didn't have trauma? Thank you, Skiffy Circo.
Yeah, they were saying that,
Right.
that they've been asked by therapists and whatnot, and yeah.
Yeah, I think that we've all encountered various kinds of trauma in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
Some of it is minor trauma. That is to say, we experience now and again thoughts or feelings around it, but we're not working hard to push it down or to cope with it.
Yeah.
And some of us have experienced much bigger traumas than that of various sorts. They will come up in your relationship.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about, we've talked a little bit about fighting. We're going to talk a little about communication styles. Does that seem like
Oh yeah,
you're
no.
keeping track of
Very,
where
very,
we are?
very,
Okay.
very logical next step. Yeah.
Attempting to do that here, ADHD. Yeah. Okay.
Join us on
So,
our roller coaster of mental health.
exactly. Okay. So, let's talk about how not to communicate, because that always helps a little. So John Gottman, fairly famous relationship therapist, written several books about marriage and commitment, and it talks about what he calls the four horsemen of the relationship apocalypse.
Oh jeez.
No,
The
right? So
relationship
these are
apocalypse. I love that.
yeah, things to never do. Okay.
Okay.
So when we're talking to our partners and when we're trying to kind of maybe um, get them to be accountable about something, or even just there's something that's bothering us that we feel the need to raise in relationship, the four horsemen are criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. So One
Yeah.
example of contempt would be rolling your eyes. It would be saying whatever. It would be the kind of dismissal we sometimes give each other, where we just get, scoffing.
Yeah.
Um,
Not
you
talking about
never do
something that
that.
might bother you, and so you're just continue every time they do it, you're just like rolling your eyes at them. Yeah.
Exactly. Um, 1 second, I'm having an issue.
It's okay. While you're fixing that, Skiffy
There we
came
go.
back in
There
the
we
chat
go.
and said, "Is gaslighting the
Technology.
fifth horseman?"
Actually, gaslighting is in there. Gaslighting is actually a form of abuse.
Yeah.
Um, it is certainly contemptuous, but what gaslighting is manipulating the other person's perception of reality,
Yeah.
in order to control them, but also to pathologize them. So, gaslighting can be as simple as, "But I told you yesterday."
Mm.
I don't remember. You don't remember. Well, you never remember anything, but trust me when
Oh.
I say we had a whole discussion, right? How are you even feeling when I say that, right? Isn't that awful? So, making the other person feel small is certainly a kind of contempt. So gaslighting kind of covers off a few different things that we see a person doing. And by the way, the term comes from a film that I think is from the late 30s. I'm trying to remember, but it
Yeah.
was called Gaslight.
Yeah. I think it was like late 20s, early 30s.
Yeah, yeah, and it's about a husband manipulating actually the lights in the house to make his wife think that she was losing her mind in order to control her.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, when we cause a person to question their own reality, of course they're much more vulnerable to whatever reality we then present. So it's very manipulative, and yes, so that's abusive.
Yeah.
So, but when we criticize, we often use also you always, you never, we all know we shouldn't do that. And criticism, of course, can be much more subtle than that. Criticism can look like undermining someone, when they're talking to another person, undermining their story is also a form of criticizing them. So criticism can be very direct.
Yeah.
You didn't do that properly, or you failed to do this, or whatever, or you never remember, or whatever. Those are all kinds of criticism, and it can also be really indirect, showing another person up, one-upping a person. This is a power play, of course, but it's also a form of criticism. So I guess I would say trust when you're feeling uncomfortable. And if someone is minimizing, where you say, that thing you did, it made me feel really small. And they say, "What are you talking about?" Or they say, "I was only joking." Or, "I don't know why you're so sensitive."
Oh, God.
What you're into when someone is saying, "I don't know why you're saying, I was only joking, you're too sensitive," this is stonewalling.
Yeah.
Or, "I don't know what you mean," when people blank you in that way, that's stonewalling. And of course, people can also be defensive. "I was only joking,"
Yeah.
can also be defensiveness. Or
I've straight up told people, I'm
sometimes
like,
they
then
go
it
on
was a
the,
bad joke.
yeah, that's
And
when
you
we're taking some accountability,
yeah,
right?
it's like, then you need to learn how comedy works, because you failed at it magnificently.
There we go. Now there's some contempt there if you say that.
Granted,
Right?
this wasn't in a relationship thing, but yeah, I've definitely said that to people.
So a big piece of this is like, trust what you're feeling. Sorry, I'm going to switch positions here
It's
and
okay.
change completely.
I think you and I have
Okay,
both
now
done
we're
that about 3
comfortable.
times. So yeah, just the ADHD little fidget.
Right, gotta move the knees. Sorry. You have to. It's really important to trust what you're feeling, and what your own heart tells you. And if in someone's presence you're feeling, tiny, or you're feeling belittled, or you're feeling diminished, trust that that's not okay, and you don't need to you don't need to be there. Call them on it, and if they can't hear it, this isn't a relationship that's going to lead to any kind of happy ever after, right? And I think this is where the projection of the happy ever after is problematic, because telling yourself a story around how happy you are, or how okay it is, or how they didn't mean it like that, eventually will undercut your own sense of the truth of the relationship, of your own true feelings, of how supported you actually are or aren't, right? So that's something to really avoid. So now that we've looked at negative communication, let's look at how we actually want to communicate.
Well, real quick, before you do that, let's take a quick break to remind our viewers of our disclaimer, and then we'll come back and talk about the good things. So we'll be right back in a few moments to talk more about that. Stick around.
Champions of Psychology is meant as education and entertainment. It is not a substitute for medical advice or professional counseling. Discussion of mental health topics will be primarily rooted in research and the personal experiences and self-disclosures of the hosts. While we can provide generalized education and possible mental health resources, we cannot offer any recommendations, advice, or opinions for any specific persons, cases, or situations. We provide these resources and links at our sole discretion, but have not necessarily vetted or reviewed any resource. We assume no liability for the use of the information or resources on these sites, and we encourage you to use your own best judgment.
Okay, we are back to talk more about this, and as a reminder, as our awesome mods just put in the chat, you can ask your questions in the chat with question : and then your question, and our awesome mods, Mars and Jordan, will grab them and put them in a little text doc that we'll talk about after a little bit. But before that, Mitra, I interrupted you with a great transition. So
it was perfect. It was just the right time to interrupt. Yeah. So okay, I wanna talk about attachment and attachment styles. Somewhere in the midst of time, being sort of around the 1960s, John Bowlby came up with attachment theory. And Bowlby and Ainsworth did a number of experiments to show how attachment worked in young children, in terms of the child's attachment to the mother, and how that attachment played out in the child's willingness to explore a new environment. Okay. So typically, young children in new environments will stay close to a parent, or at least check in if a parent's present. The more secure the child is, the more willing they might be to trust that the parent is nearby and trust that they're safe to explore. And how this plays out in adulthood is interesting, because they didn't till recently, I'd say about the last 20 years or so, really look at attachment in terms of not just childhood attachment, but how it plays out in adult relationships.
Interesting.
But it does.
Yeah.
And so there's been a lot of research. There is actually a sort of the adult attachment interview, which talks about adult attachment styles. A lot of people now will quite openly talk about their attachment style based on their own discussions with their therapist. And so if we're aware of how we attach based on our family history, we have an important piece of information that helps us work out relationships. So as I shared previously in that first argument where my fiance was walking out the door, my own anxious attachment or fear of no attachment, fear of abandonment came right up. And I was certainly aware that I feared abandonment because of my life experience. And that fear of abandonment sometimes ran my story. And I was certainly also aware that prior to that relationship, in early relationships that I'd had, dating experiences and such. Sometimes the fear of losing the partner meant that I stayed in relationships longer than I should have because I didn't want to be an abandoner, or chose partners who I felt were safe choices. They wouldn't ever leave me. Whether I was bored with them or not was another, was neither here nor there at the time. But so what we don't want is our attachment style to be running our decisions. It comes into play. We need to be aware of it. We need to be kind to ourselves because of it, but we don't want it to run our show. We don't want it to decide on our relationships on our behalf. I personally would prefer to choose my relationships with my full self, not just a terrified piece of me that is somehow making my decisions, right? So I think this is why personal exploration and understanding is so key to good relationships. So the 4 attachment styles, by the way, are secure, ambivalent, avoidant, and disordered. So I think secure is pretty obvious to most of us. Your sense of self-worth is good. Your identity is fairly developed in the sense that you're quite comfortable with yourself. You've got good self-worth, as I said. With ambivalent attachment style, people might experience you as a little bit hot and cold. So ambivalent and avoidant can look pretty similar. An ambivalent style might also mean that you get super involved in the other person's life. So it can look quite codependent. And an avoidant style can look really dismissive. So you know how in I think not just in therapy, but I think in relationships we kind of see a dynamic develop where one person ends up being the pursuer and the other ends up being the distancer. And I see this in therapy a lot, where one person kind of seems like they're almost more invested in the relationship. And the other person is kind of pushing away. But we can jump to conclusions about this. The idea that one person's more invested, that might actually, I don't think that's the case. I think it can also look like one person is pushing at the other person's boundaries and the other person is just trying to kind of get some space for themselves. So however you interpret it, it's easy to jump to conclusions about what's going on. But when we examine the dynamic, we learn a lot more. From a therapeutic perspective, again, it depends, right?
Favorite line.
But yeah, exactly, for good reason. But I do think that it can point to ambivalent avoidant attachment styles. When we talk about disordered attachment styles, it can look really chaotic about what's happening with someone. It can be attached to other kinds of personality disorders even. But really what it means is that there's probably been a lot of chaos in that person's life. And sometimes for someone who's had a lot of really tough or traumatic experiences, it can be very, very difficult for them to trust that there's going to be consistent care and love from a partner. Imagine someone who's been through, say, 5 foster homes, or someone who's experienced abuse, or someone who lost family young, or someone who's had an experience as a refugee. And maybe move to different camps. All of these experiences are breaks in the secure attachment that they may have otherwise built with someone in their lives or even with a place. And when we've had a lot of insecurity and can't trust attachment, that's really difficult. And so humans are really good at masking. All of us can appear quite normal and we know what's expected a lot of the time in terms of our responses. And this is why early dating can look so great.
Mm-hmm.
It can all look so perfect,
Yep.
but we
Honeymoon
haven't yet
phase.
reached totally. And what I've seen with people is sometimes it can take trauma years to emerge.
Mm.
And sometimes it will only emerge under specific circumstances.
Mm.
For instance, if you had a lot of difficult experiences as a child, traumatic material around that may not again arise until you yourself have children.
Interesting.
Which does not mean you won't be a good parent.
Yeah.
Please understand
Oh,
that
yeah,
is
yeah.
not what I'm saying. Yeah, but what it does mean is that there is perhaps some work to do that will emerge once you are a parent yourself.
Yeah.
And I can personally vouch for this. As a baby, I was given into the care of my grandparents when I was 13 months old. When my first child turned 13 months, it was like an internal bomb went off.
Oh, interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
There was the whole, oh my God, this kid is so little. How did my mom even manage to do that?
Yeah.
How did she even have the strength or the ability or the whatever to actually hand me over?
Yeah.
What would that have looked like? And then I would move heaven and earth to not ever have to do that.
Yeah.
And so I had a lot of questions
Mm-hmm.
that I thought I had answered, but I had not answered them from a felt perspective of embodying motherhood and holding a 13-month-old in my arms. So this is what I'm talking about. These are challenges to relationship, however they show up.
Yeah.
And so I think that what we come to now is love isn't enough.
Mm-hmm.
Because it doesn't actually matter how much you love someone. You can love them a lot, and they can still not be the person to do long-term relationship with.
Mm-hmm.
You can love someone and they can be the parent of your kids, and it might still be time to end the relationship.
Yeah.
So I think we were talking about two different quotes that kind of said the same thing.
Yeah.
Do you want to share yours
Yeah,
first?
I was telling Mitra before the show that I used to work at GameStop like way back in the day. It was like I think it was my first job, one of my first jobs, and I don't remember how me and this literally random customer whose name I don't think I ever got on the topic of relationships, and from the other side of the store just drops this profound truth bomb of a relationship is not about about how you feel about someone. It's about how someone makes you feel about yourself. And I was floored. I was like, I did not come into work today expecting to get this knowledge. Thank you. But I'm going to be thinking about that for eternity. Um, and yeah, like I literally thought about that like almost every time it's come to like a relationship thing, and it's how I knew that the relationship that I'm in was right for me. It
Yeah,
was a wild thing to hear.
yeah, yeah. I think that as a piece of that, it just occurred to me that when I see other people in relationships, and I don't mean clients, I mean friends or family or even my kids, one of the things that I find myself looking for is, are they still the same person when they are with their partner
Mm,
that they are when they are with me, that they are when they're with their family or whoever,
mm-hmm.
as long as their family is supportive, that is, right? Because we've all been around our partners, or some of us have had the experience of being with our partners, going and visiting with their family, and noticing the change
Mm-hmm.
and noticing what that experience is like for them.
Yeah.
So, but in general, what we want to see is that you get to consistently be yourself with your partner, that you get to bring your full self,
Yeah.
that what you see reflected is you, and that you also holds the space for change. Because I've now been married for 26 years, and there's a lot of change and there's a lot of consistency. And we'll get to that piece around change in just a moment. But but the quote that I was thinking of was from The Accidental Tourist, the movie, which came out ages ago. But there's this moment where the couple who are estranged get back together for a bit, and it doesn't work. And so he tells her he's leaving, and she says, "But we still love each other. I still love you. Why?" And he says, "It's not how much you love someone. It's who you are when you're with them."
Mm-hmm.
So it's who they see, and it's who you see, and it's how you feel. And it's not the projected how you feel. It's the developed how you feel during the course of the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And it plays into actually how we fight and how we argue as well. How connected to myself do I feel? How regulated do I get to stay? Maybe I need to think about my words, and do they really reflect what I'm feeling? Are they reflective of my fears around loss or attachment? Are they reflective of my fears around being diminished? Are they actually true to my lived experience with this person? Right? You always, you never, you this, you that. We often throw blame around, which is another piece around good communication, is like, I am experiencing, I feel. And it can refer to something they've done. It can be, when you leave the dishes in the sink, it feels to me like you're leaving them for me. Now, maybe they're not, but I want to check it out.
Yeah.
Do you feel like it's my job to do these things? Can we share in this? Whose job is it? And how do we work that out? And if I am the one doing the dishes, are you the one cooking? Like, how are we navigating and negotiating these things? And I'd say the big things we negotiate are tasks. And so task allocation is a really big one. Parenting is another really big one. Sex is also a really big thing that we navigate. And the other one is money. And these are the 4 things that we have to negotiate and navigate in relationship. Along with that, along come values, religion and so on. What does commitment look like? Fidelity or not fidelity? And kind of, there's broader questions that I would hope before you're in a committed relationship, you work some of that out.
Yeah.
It will not settle by itself. I'll tell you that. We love each other. It doesn't matter that he's
everything
this and
else
I'm
will
that
just...
and you're that. No.
Yeah.
Sort it out.
Yep.
There's no it depends around that one. Every relationship needs to do that. So
okay. Let's check in with some questions real quick here towards the end of the episode, because we did get quite a few questions, and we're not gonna be able to get to all of them, but we do a past questions season finale each season. So in a few episodes, be sure to check back, and we might grab your question and talk about it there. Let's see. Let's go with let's start with Lightning Hawk. Question: Isn't happily ever after subjective based on the individual, as each individual might consider a thing, object, etc. differently?
Absolutely. And so happily ever after in relational terms is negotiated and navigated by 2 people or more, depending, right? Because I don't get to decide what anyone's happy ever after is. There are non-negotiables, like it helps if you have similar values. Obviously, it helps if you can appreciate and understand each other's moral perspective as well. It helps if you understand each other's communication styles, each other's attachment styles, and each other's arguing styles. And of course, trust is crucial. So regardless of everything else, those things are pretty significant pieces of happily ever after.
Absolutely. Okay, we're gonna go with for the last one we got here, we're gonna go with Lurking Writer. Lurking Writer says, question: Do you think that pop culture has defined happily ever after? Has it existed across cultures and history as it has informed the way we tell stories, or is it a combination of those things? And the answer is, it depends.
I mean, I think culturally, each culture has its notion of, at the very least, given patriarchal and heterosexual biases,
Yeah.
each culture has a definition of what happy relationship or what happy marriage looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Ideas about what we should and shouldn't be contented with, ideas around what is negotiable and non-negotiable in relationships. And those have seemed to have persisted across culture and across time periods as well. So some cultures have taken into account personal happiness, and others seem to prioritize family happiness or even family wealth.
True.
You know, if you think about arranged marriages during the medieval period, in terms of, you know, at least upper class, whatever,
Yeah.
you think about, you know, my estate marches alongside yours. The land acquisition would be good for both of our families, etc.
Yeah.
So you must have heirs, that kind of thing, and graces, but no. So yes.
Yeah, I definitely think that, like, when it comes to, like, the pop culture thing, I definitely think pop culture was informed by those previous, you know, stories through history and everything. I mean, I think one of the reasons it might be so big is because Disney at one point was like, "Hey, we don't want to come up with new things. We're gonna go back and tell these fairy tales. Oh, look, we've got these princesses that live happily ever after," and then that becomes like the mainstream thing because everyone's talking about those films. So it's definitely
Well,
one influencing the other.
sure. And I also think that fairy tales and stories, if you think about where they came from, you know, they were teaching us about how to be
Yeah.
in the context of culture, right? If you think about the oral tradition of storytelling, there were probably variations in
Oh
each
yeah.
family and community as well. But the purpose of those stories was to shape our thinking and expectations around relationships, and then, of course, to some degree, our hopes, naturally. But you know, stories, particularly old fairy tales, held archetypes that were significant.
Yeah.
You know, if we look at some of them where the princess, for example, has to separate through the grains, right? She's given three impossible tasks, you know, and one of them is, here's all these poppy seeds, you know, or grains or whatever, you know, find, you know, clean them up, get all the. So this is about discrimination. This is about being able to discriminate what is significant, about being able to process a lot of material and make sense of what's important. Stories are very metaphorical.
Yep.
And that's a whole other
That
area
is
of
a
psychology.
whole other one. Yeah,
It's a
exactly.
whole other thing. But it is a significant piece of two people need to be ready.
Yeah.
There is a quest. This is going to show our readiness. There is something heroic. Love doesn't run smooth. That's really important. We have to go through some trials. That's often a message here.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Well, I think that is a good place to start wrapping things up. Mitra, thank you for talking with me today about this and bringing all your knowledge on it. Where, if people want to find you and what you do on the interwebs, where could they do so?
So they can find me, of course, at Mitra Jordan on Twitter. They can find me at mitrajordan.com, which is my website. And do feel free to reach out if you would like. And I look forward to many more discussions about this topic.
Yeah, because we in the prep for this one, we were figuring out so many things. It's like, oh yeah, no, we have to talk about this one with Dr. B. We have to talk about this one with Dr. B. We got to talk about this one in the future. So we almost came up with a whole list of episodes just from this one idea.
Relationships are important.
They are.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah.
You can follow me on Twitter at the Treavor. There's an A hiding in there. Thank you to Mars and Jordan for doing an amazing job moderating the chat today. They need to Codename Entertainment and Take This for giving us an opportunity to have these discussions. This week's schedule, there's a few differences here and there. Isle Champions Presents just started yesterday, and that's going to be going for a few weeks. We have a new show starting up tomorrow called Artomancy with Mars and Kat doing some really cool artwork, so be sure to check that out. You can always find our schedules on our Discord, our Reddit, and our Twitter account. But that is going to do it for this week's episode of Champions Psychology. So until next week, take care of yourself.
Champions of Psychology is meant as education and entertainment. It is not a substitute for medical advice or professional counseling. Discussion of mental health topics will be primarily rooted in research and the personal experiences and self-disclosures of the hosts. While we can provide generalized education and possible mental health resources, we cannot offer any recommendations, advice, or opinions for any specific persons, cases, or situations. We provide these resources and links at our sole discretion, but have not necessarily vetted or reviewed any resource. We assume no liability for the use of the information or resources on these sites, and we encourage you to use your own best judgment.